For more than 300 years after it was first discovered by Europeans, much of Florida remained nearly empty.
A wild and dangerous frontier on the edge of the map.
Tonight, we're taking a look at a surprising chapter of American history.
When people think about the oldest settlements in the United States, they usually picture the English colonies of Jamestown or Plymouth. But the actual beginning of European America began much earlier in Florida. In 1565, Spain founded St. Augustine, making it the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the United States. Despite this early start, Florida would remain one of the least populated places on the East Coast for nearly 3 centuries. In 1513, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon landed somewhere along the east coast of Florida. He named it La Florida, meaning land of flowers, claiming the land for Spain. Every year, Spanish treasure fleets carrying gold and silver from the Americas sailed through the Straits of Florida on their way back to Spain. Control of Florida meant control of the shipping route. To protect those fleets, Spain established military outposts along the coast. The most important of these was St. Augustine. Before Europeans arrived, it's estimated that 350,000 Native Americans lived across Florida. Large and powerful societies such as the Timucua, Calusa, and Appalachia dominated different regions of Florida. The Calusa, who controlled southwest Florida, were powerful and resisted Spanish expeditions and settlements in their territory. Spain attempted to build missions and settlements across Florida during the 15 and 1600s, but colonizing Florida was far harder than expected. Unlike the English colonies farther north, Florida offered few economic opportunities. The climate was hot and humid. Hurricanes destroyed settlements along the coasts. Dense forests and swamps made travel difficult. Disease also devastated both native populations and Spanish settlers. Spain never sent large numbers of people to colonize Florida. Instead, the colony was used as a military outpost. Even after nearly a century of Spanish rule, Florida's population remained extremely small. By the mid-1600s, the entire European population of Florida was in the hundreds, most of them living in or around St. Augustine. The English colony of Virginia already had tens of thousands of settlers by that point. Florida's entire population was smaller than many towns in the English colonies. Outside of St. Augustine, much of Florida remained wilderness. Because Florida was constantly threatened by rival European powers, Spain began building stronger defenses. In the late 1600s, Spain constructed the massive stone fortress known as Castillo de San Marcos. The fortress protected St. Augustine from attacks by pirates and English colonists. English settlers from South Carolina and Georgia repeatedly raided Spanish Florida during the late 16 and early 1700s. In 1702, English forces burned much of St. Augustine during the Siege of St. Augustine, forcing residents to take shelter inside the walls of the Castillo. By the early 1700s, Spanish Florida began to collapse. English raids destroyed many Spanish missions that had been built among native communities. At the same time, European diseases had devastated the native population. Entire tribes began to disappear. By the mid-1700s, Florida's total population, including soldiers, settlers, and the indigenous, was only a few thousand people. Northern cities like Boston and Philadelphia already had populations at around 15,000 people. While the rest of the East Coast developed, into thriving colonies. After more than 200 years of Spanish rule, Florida remained a wild and desolate frontier. In many ways, Florida was becoming the Wild West of the East Coast, long before the American West even existed. But everything changed in 1763. That year, the global conflict known as the 7 Years' War came to an end, reshaping the map of North America. As part of the peace agreement, Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in exchange for control of Havana, Cuba, and Manila in the Philippines. After more than 200 years, Spanish Florida was now under British control. When the British took over, they inherited an empty colony with few settlements. Britain aimed to make Florida a prosperous colony, similar to Georgia or South Carolina. Britain divided the territory into 2 colonies, East Florida with its capital at St. Augustine, and West Florida with its capital, Pensacola. The British immediately began encouraging immigration. They offered large land grants to settlers willing to move south. For the first time in Florida's history, the colony began growing. Plantations began to spring up across northern Florida. Settlers started growing crops such as indigo, rice, sugar, and cotton. Roads were built connecting settlements. Ports expanded to support trade with other colonies. By the 1770s, Florida was finally starting to grow. The population had reached around 17,000 people, a small number compared to other colonies, but it was the largest European population Florida had seen. For the first time, it was possible that Florida might become a thriving British colony, but history had other plans. The American Revolutionary War broke out in 1775. The other 13 colonies joined the rebellion, but Florida remained loyal to Great Britain. Because of this, Florida became a refuge for loyalists fleeing the war. Thousands fled south into Florida. The American Revolution ended in 1783, and the outcome would reshape Florida's future. Britain lost the war. As part of the peace treaty, Britain agreed to return Florida to Spain. Rather than live under Spanish rule, thousands of British Florida residents abandoned the colony. Within just a few years, Florida's population collapsed again. By the late 1780s, the population had fallen back to only a few thousand people. Florida returned to being a remote frontier. Most lived in or around St. Augustine or Pensacola. Outside the settlements, much of Florida was unexplored. Spain controlled the territory, but they struggled to maintain order. By the early 1800s, Florida had become one of the most chaotic regions in North America. The peninsula was filled with runaway slaves escaping from plantations in Georgia and South Carolina. Smugglers and traders, pirates raiding along the coast, and Native Americans fleeing from war in America. Among those Native American groups were the Seminoles, a people formed from various tribes who had migrated into Florida during the 1700s and 1800s. They established villages across northern and central Florida and became one of the most powerful groups in the region. Spain lacked resources to control their territory, and as the United States expanded, American leaders began to see Florida as a problem that needed to be solved. Tensions reached a breaking point in the early 1800s. American forces began conducting military raids into Spanish Florida, pursuing runaway slaves and attacking Seminole villages. The most famous commander was General Andrew Jackson. In 1818, Jackson invaded Florida during what became known as the First Seminole War. His forces captured Spanish towns and forts and executed British nationals for helping the Seminoles. Jackson showed that Spain could no longer defend the territory. Spain agreed to sell Florida to the United States with the Adam-Oyens Treaty in 1819. The United States officially took control of Florida in 1821. At that time, the population of the entire territory was around 8,000 people, one of the least populated places in the young United States. America's control over Florida led to a new conflict. The United States wanted to remove natives from Florida and open the land for settlers, but the Seminole people resisted. This resistance led to a series of conflicts known as the Seminole Wars, which lasted for decades. The most famous of these conflicts was the Second Seminole War, which began in 1835. The Seminole Wars became one of the longest and most expensive Indian wars in American history. Seminole fighters used Florida's remote swamps, its dense forest, and fast-moving rivers to their advantage. They launched surprise attacks and then disappeared into the wilderness. One of their most famous leaders was Osceola, who became a symbol of Seminole resistance. For American troops, the war was a nightmare. Disease, brutal heat, and difficult travel tormented the troops. Many Americans were unwilling to move into a region where fighting could break out at any moment. Even after Florida gained statehood in 1845, large parts of the peninsula remained empty. By 1840, Florida's population had grown to around 54,000 people, but compared to other states, that number was incredibly small. For example, Georgia had a population of 690,000, South Carolina 590,000, and North Carolina 750,000. Outside of the few towns and plantations, mostly in North Florida, the peninsula was still wilderness. Traveling through Central or South Florida often meant weeks of moving through swamps and forests. By the time the American Civil War began in 1861, Florida's population had reached only about 140,000, and nearly half of those were enslaved people working on plantations in northern and central Florida. Even the largest towns had only a few thousand residents. Most of the central and southern regions were largely wilderness. After nearly 350 years of European contact, Florida was still a frontier. That was about to change. Florida had been incredibly difficult to reach. There were few roads. The ones that existed were often little more than sandy trails. Traveling across the peninsula took weeks. Dense forest, deep rivers, and swamps made travel slow and dangerous. Even by the late 1800s, most people entering Florida arrived by ship. One of the first men to transform Florida was railroad tycoon Henry B. Plant. He expanded rail lines across western Florida, connecting the interior of the state to ports along the Gulf Coast. His railroad helped develop cities, most notably Tampa. Plant also built luxury hotels to attract wealthy northerners escaping cold winters. One of the most famous and lavish was the Tampa Bay Hotel. Another businessman was reshaping Florida's East Coast, oil tycoon Henry Flagler. He believed Florida would become America's premier winter destination. To make that happen, he began building the Florida East Coast Railway, extending lines farther and farther south. He built entire resort cities, luxury hotels, railroad stations, and new communities. In 1896, Flagler's railroad reached Miami. For the first time in history, Florida was easy to visit. Tourists from northern states could board a train and arrive in Florida within days. Crops could be shipped across the country. Land value rose. As a result, Florida's population began to grow rapidly. After the Civil War, the state's population was about 140,000 people. but by 1880 it climbed to around 269,000 residents. By 1890, the population reached 391,000, and by 1900, Florida's population had exploded to more than 528,000 people. After centuries, Florida was finally beginning to boom. The railroads marked the end of Florida's long frontier era. Looking back at Florida's history, it's clear why the state developed so differently from the rest of the East Coast. While other colonies grew rapidly, Florida spent centuries as a remote military outpost. It was not until the arrival of railroads that Florida's isolation was broken. Only then did the state begin the explosive growth that would transform it into one of the most populated and visited states in America. 23.7 million people live in Florida, but for most of its history, Florida was a vast, wild frontier on the East Coast. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.